Before thrones, there were shrines. Before kings, there were priests. This is the untold truth buried beneath the surface of African history. The great civilizations that rose and fell across this vast continent were not built on swords and crowns alone. They were sustained by a quieter, deeper force, the power of the priesthood. These were the custodians of memory, the interpreters of the unseen, the architects of balance who stood between the human and the divine. Without them, no king could rule, no law could endure, and no community could survive. They were not merely religious officials, as later colonial narratives tried to reduce them to. They were the original engineers of society's invisible architecture. The central question we ask is simple, yet profound. Were priesthoods simply religious functionaries, or were they, in fact, the true architects of African civilizations? To answer this, we must strip away the narrow lenses imposed by outsiders and look at African priesthoods on their own terms. These men and women were more than priests in the European sense. They were healers who mended not only the body, but the soul. They were judges who upheld cosmic justice with symbols and rituals older than any courtroom. They were astronomers who tracked the stars and marked the rhythms of ritual calendars long before modern science gave them names. They were diviners, decoding the mysteries of destiny and misfortune. And above all, they were guardians of cosmic balance, ensuring that the seen and the unseen remained in harmony so that life itself could flourish. When African communities gathered in circle, when offerings of kola nuts, libation, or blood were placed upon the earth, it was the priesthood that stood at the center. Their role was not ornamental, it was existential. They carried the responsibility of aligning human affairs with the eternal laws of the cosmos. A king could claim lineage, but it was the priesthood that confirmed his legitimacy. A warrior could fight with strength, but it was the priesthood that consecrated his cause. A farmer could till the soil, but it was the priesthood that called the rains and blessed the harvest. They were not merely present, they were the axis upon which the community turned. This journey takes us into the hidden sanctuaries of the African past, into the shrines, groves, temples, and caves where the voice of the ancestors was heard. We will travel across Africa, west, central, south, east, and the Nile Valley to uncover the hidden codes of priesthood. In the forests of Nigeria, we will meet the Yoruba Babalawo and the Igbo Dibia, interpreters of destiny. In Ghana and Ivory Coast, the Akana Komfo, mediums of the gods who made kings tremble. Among the Efik and Ibibio, the Ekpe priests, and them priestesses who commanded law and spirit alike. In the Congo Basin, the Nganga, healers and masters of sacred medicine. In the south, the Shona Mhondoro, mediums of lion spirits who ruled beside kings, and the Xhosa Amagirha, interpreters of dreams. To the east, the Kikuyu priests at Mount Kenya, the Maasai Lebons, and the Nuer leopard skin priests who mediated blood feuds. And finally, we ascend to the Nile, where Nubian and Kemetic priests once charted the stars and guarded the temples of Amun, Ra, and Ma'at, crafting the very foundations of human civilization. This is not just a history of ritual, it is a history of power. Priesthoods were not shadows beside the throne, they were the throne's foundation. To explore them is to uncover the true heartbeat of African civilization. The journey begins now. West Africa has long been a cradle of some of the continent's most influential priesthood systems, a region where shrines and sacred groves stood not at the margins of society, but at its very heart. Here, the priesthood was not a separate institution, detached from the people. It was interwoven into the very fabric of everyday life. To walk through the towns, forests, and marketplaces of this region centuries ago was to move within a living network of spiritual codes, constantly mediated and reinforced by priests, diviners, healers, and mediums. Each community carried its own expression of the divine, but across the region, there was a shared understanding. The priesthood was the memory of the ancestors and the mouthpiece of the gods. To begin uncovering the hidden power of priesthoods, we must start here in West Africa, where the role of the sacred specialist was as broad and sophisticated as any intellectual institution in the world. Among the Yoruba of present-day Nigeria and Benin, the Babalawo stands as one of the most iconic and enduring figures of African priesthood. The Babalawo is more than a priest. He is a custodian of Ifa, the divination system often described as a cosmic library. Ifa is not just ritual, it is a structured system of knowledge containing hundreds of verses known as Odu, which encompass wisdom about morality, medicine, history, and cosmology. When a client approaches the Babalawo, he consults the divination chain, the opele or sacred palm notes, casting them upon the mat to reveal patterns. These patterns correspond to one of the 256 Odu, each of which contains layers of stories, proverbs, and prescriptions. In this way, the Babalawo does not merely predict the future. He diagnoses the present, connects it to the past, and prescribes pathways toward balance. His role is as much that of a philosopher and healer as it is of a diviner. He stands as a cosmic librarian, accessing the wisdom of the universe on behalf of the people, ensuring that their lives remain in alignment with destiny and with Orunmila, the deity of wisdom and divination. Where the Yoruba Babalawo interprets the Odu, the Igbo Dibia acts as a spirit technician, navigating between the human world and the world of the unseen. In Igbo cosmology, the Dibia is central to the health and harmony of society. Far from being a mere herbalist, the Dibia was a custodian of Ofo and Ogu, the sacred symbols of truth and justice. Ofo, often embodied in a carved staff, represented the moral authority of the ancestors, while Ogu represented innocence and righteousness. To swear by Ofo and Ogu was to bind oneself to truth itself. The Dibia enforced this moral order, not by wielding political power, but by invoking spiritual law that no king could override. When conflicts arose, it was the Dibia who was consulted to discern guilt, innocence, or spiritual causes of misfortune. Beyond justice, Dibias also healed through herbs, roots, and incantations. But even medicine was not simply physical. It was inseparable from spiritual causality. Illness could stem from broken taboos, restless ancestors, or malevolent forces. And the Dibia was the one who traced these invisible threads. To the Igbo, the Dibia was proof that the world was layered with meaning, that nothing happened by accident, and everything could be understood if one had the eyes to see. In Ghana and Ivory Coast, the Akan Akomfo, carried out a different, though equally powerful role. The Akomfo were shrine priests who served as mediums for the Abosom, the deities associated with rivers, forests, fertility, and cosmic forces. Unlike the Ifa priest, who worked through structured codes, the Akomfo worked primarily through possession. During ceremonies, they entered trance, allowing the Abosom to mount them like riders on a horse. In this state, the deity spoke directly to the community through the priest, delivering guidance, warnings, or blessings. This was not performance. It was the very heart of Akan governance and spirituality. Kings, or Asantehene, ruled with a political authority, but they could not ignore the voices of the Akomfo, for the gods were higher than kings. In fact, the Akomfo were often kingmakers, endorsing or challenging rulers by invoking divine approval or disapproval. In times of drought, war, or plague, it was to the Akomfo that the people turned. Their role as mediums of the Abosom tied them to the spiritual ecology of the land, reminding society that no human power could sever itself from nature or the unseen. Moving eastward into the lands of the Yue in Togo, Ghana, and Benin, we find the Afa priests, custodians of a divination system that resonates with Ifa but carries its own unique structures. The Afa priest is the interpreter of destiny, diagnosing spiritual imbalances and prescribing ritual actions to restore harmony. Closely tied to the wider traditions of Vodun, the Afa priest operates within a system where shrines and deities, known as Vodun, permeate every aspect of life. The priesthood here was not simply about foretelling, it was about maintaining a living relationship between humans, nature, and the divine. In Vodun shrines, priests and priestesses cared for sacred objects, organized rituals, and acted as conduits for spirits who possessed them during ceremonies. These ceremonies were not entertainment, but survival, ensuring fertility, protection, justice, and communal well-being. The Afa priesthood demonstrates how West African divination systems were not isolated traditions, but part of a shared intellectual and spiritual heritage, where the cosmos itself was understood as a code waiting to be read. Among the Ibibio and Efik of southeastern Nigeria and parts of Cameroon, priesthood took on another dimension through the powerful Ekpe society and in them priestesses. The Ekpe society functioned as both a spiritual and judicial institution, regulating community law, initiation, and governance. Its priests enforced justice through rituals and secret knowledge, often expressed in Nsibidi, the symbolic writing system used to encode laws, proverbs, and spiritual instructions. The Ekpe priests were therefore not only religious figures, but lawmakers, ensuring order within society through a sacred authority. Alongside them, the Ndem priestesses served as custodians of the water spirits. These female priestesses mediated the powers of the river and sea, embodying fertility, wealth, and protection. Together, the Ekpe priests and Ndem priestesses created a dual system that safeguarded both law and spiritual ecology. To enter their sacred spaces was to step into a world where water, law, spirit, and symbol converged, where justice and fertility were understood as inseparable forces. West Africa's priesthoods reveal a striking truth. These were not marginal figures, but the foundation upon which society stood. The Babalawo held libraries of cosmic wisdom. The Dibia enforced truth and justice as moral law. The Akomfo embodied the voices of gods who could crown or depose kings. The Afa priests and Vodun keepers ensured that destiny was interpreted and aligned. The Ekpe priests and Ndem priestesses bound society together with law, symbol, and spirit. Taken together, they remind us that priesthood was not a minor branch of tradition. It was the very center of civilization itself. It is here in West Africa that we see the clearest evidence that priests were not servants of kings, but their equals, sometimes even their superiors, because they spoke with the voice of the gods, the ancestors, and the cosmos itself. The Congo Basin, stretching across modern-day Democratic Republic of Congo, Angola, Central African Republic, and beyond, has long been regarded as the spiritual heart of Africa. Here, in dense forests and river valleys, priesthood systems evolved that did not simply serve villages but shaped entire kingdoms. In this region, priests were not only healers and diviners, they were the architects of law, the guardians of sacred kingship, and the interpreters of fate itself. Central Africa is where spiritual knowledge, political authority, and cosmic balance were fused together into institutions so deeply woven into society that they defined the very rhythm of life. To understand this heartland is to recognize how African priesthoods operated not on the margins of power, but as its very foundation. Among the Congo people, the figure of the Nganga stands as one of the most enduring and complex examples of African priesthood. The Nganga was a healer, diviner, and mediator between the living and the spiritual world. But their power extended far beyond the role of a local doctor. At the core of their practice was the use of nkisi, sacred objects imbued with spiritual power. These could be carved figures, bundles, or vessels filled with substances such as herbs, soil, animal parts, or stones. To the untrained eye, an nkisi might appear to be nothing more than a charm or idol, but in the hands of Nganga, it became a living force, a channel for ancestral spirits and divine energies. Each nkisi was tailored to specific needs: healing illness, protecting against witchcraft, ensuring victory in war, or securing justice in disputes. Far from being superstition, this was a practical spiritual technology, grounded in a cosmology that saw the visible and invisible worlds as intertwined. The Nganga was also the keeper of the Congo cosmogram, the Dikenga, a circular cross that mapped the cycle of existence. To the Congo people, life did not move in a straight line, but in a circle, with birth, death, and rebirth forming stages on a continuous journey. The Nganga used this cosmogram as both a teaching tool and a divination guide, interpreting the transitions of individuals and communities within this sacred cycle. In this way, the Nganga was not only a healer but also a philosopher and cosmologist, holding together the people's understanding of their place in the universe. When European missionaries and colonizers arrived, they often dismissed the Nganga as witch doctors. But the truth is that these priests held one of the most sophisticated systems of metaphysical knowledge in Africa, blending medicine, ethics, law, and cosmology into a unified practice. Further east, among the Luba and Lunda peoples of present-day Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia, priesthood took on another dimension, one inseparably linked to kingship itself. The Luba and Lunda kingdoms were highly organized states with sacred kingship at their core. But the authority of the king was never purely political. It was always mediated through spiritual legitimacy. Here, the priest diviners served as the interpreters of that legitimacy. A king could not rule effectively without the blessing, for they were seen as the channels of ancestral will. Divination, particularly through the casting of sacred objects or the interpretation of omens, was a central part of political decision-making. When to go to war, when to plant crops, when to settle disputes, all required the consultation of priest diviners. They ensured that royal power was not arbitrary, but aligned with the ancestors and with cosmic balance. In the Luba system, for example, sacred stools and relics symbolized the authority of both kings and priests, connecting them directly to the founding ancestors of the kingdom. These objects were not mere symbols of political office. They were vessels of spiritual presence believed to hold the very essence of past rulers and spirits. To sit upon or invoke these relics was to enter into communion with the invisible, binding current actions to ancestral mandates. The Londade likewise maintained elaborate systems of priesthood around royal courts, ensuring that every decree of the ruler carried the weight of spiritual sanction. In both cultures, priest-diviners were not simply advisors, they were the moral and cosmic compass of the kingdom. Without them, kingship would have been reduced to brute force. With them, it became a sacred trust, embedded in the fabric of the cosmos. If the Congo and Luba-Lunda priesthoods reveal how priests safeguarded cosmology and kingship, the Zande of Central Africa show us another remarkable role of priesthood, that of arbiter of truth through oracles. Among the Zande, the most feared and respected institution was the poison oracle known as Benj. The priest who administered Benj was not merely a diviner, but a figure of immense authority, for the poison oracle was regarded as the highest form of truth-seeking. The process involved administering poison to a chicken, with the fate of the animal serving as the verdict of the spirits. While this may seem strange to modern sensibilities, for the Zand, it was a deeply rational system, built on the conviction that the universe responds to human inquiry if approached correctly. The poison oracle was used to settle disputes, to detect witchcraft, and to determine guilt or innocence in matters that no human court could easily decide. The priest in charge of the poison oracle was thus not a peripheral figure, but a judge, a mediator, and an investigator whose rulings could determine the fate of individuals and entire communities. The oracle was considered so powerful that even kings submitted to its verdicts. Its authority lay in its perceived impartiality. Unlike human judges who could be bribed or swayed by bias, the oracle spoke with the voice of the spirits, uncorrupted by human will. In this way, the Zande priesthood reveals another layer of African priestly power, the ability to arbitrate truth in a way that transcended human fallibility. To doubt the oracle was to doubt the cosmos itself. Taken together, the priesthood systems of Central Africa illustrate a profound principle, that power in African societies was never purely secular, never stripped of spiritual meaning. The Nganga of the Congo healed the body and soul while teaching cosmological truths. The priest-diviners of the Luba and Lunda sustained the sacred legitimacy of kingship, ensuring that rulers governed not by force alone, but by alignment with the ancestors. The poison oracle priests of the Zande served as the supreme arbiters of truth, delivering justice that no human judge could rival. Each in their own way, these priesthoods demonstrate that African civilization was built not on chaos or arbitrary rule, but on carefully maintained systems of balance, truth, and cosmic order. Central Africa then was not simply a forested hinterland, as colonial narratives often implied. It was a seat of profound intellectual and spiritual authority, where priesthoods served as the heartbeat of society. The kingdoms and communities of this region were sustained not only by kings and warriors, but by priests whose knowledge reached beyond the visible. In the Congo Basin, to rule was to be in harmony with the unseen, and to govern without the guidance of priests was to invite disaster. If West Africa gave us the intellectual sophistication of Ifa and the judicial power of Ekpe, Central Africa gave us the healing wisdom of Nkisi, the sacred legitimacy of kingship, and the incorruptible truth of the poison oracle. Here, in the heart of Africa, priesthood was nothing less than the architecture of reality itself. Southern Africa presents yet another layer of priesthood traditions that reveal how profoundly spirituality and governance were interwoven across the continent. Here, priesthood was not simply about maintaining shrines or interpreting omens. It was about survival itself. The land, the rain, and the ancestors were all bound together in an intricate relationship that could not be managed through brute force or kingship alone. priesthoods in this region often carried the weighty responsibility of rainmaking, spirit mediation, and ancestral communication. They stood at the crossroads between nature and society, ensuring that human life remained in harmony with the forces that governed fertility, justice, and continuity. In southern Africa, priests were not mere assistants to rulers. They were often the decisive voices, the custodians of balance, and the guardians of the land's sacred memory. Among the Shona people of present-day Zimbabwe, the institution of the Mhondoro spirit mediums stands as one of the most striking priesthood systems in all of Africa. The Mhondoro are not ordinary spirits, but great ancestral lion spirits believed to be connected to royal lineages and the land itself. The spirit mediums who serve them are vessels, chosen to be mounted by these powerful beings during rituals and ceremonies. When possessed, the medium becomes the voice of the Mhondoro, delivering guidance on matters ranging from warfare and governance to agriculture and moral order. What makes this priesthood especially significant is its role in connecting land, kingship, and ancestry. A king, or mambo, might wield political power, but he could not ignore the authority of the Mhondoro spirits, for they were seen as the true owners of the land. The medium, therefore, became a kind of sacred mediator, ensuring that rulers acted within the ancestral and cosmic order. The Shona experience demonstrates how priesthood was inseparable from ecology and politics. If the rains failed, if warfare threatened, or if the community lost its way, the Mhondoro spirits spoke through their mediums to realign society. Even in modern times, during Zimbabwe's liberation struggles of the 20th century, spirit mediums played a pivotal role, calling fighters to battle under ancestral mandate. This continuity shows that priesthood here was never an archaic relic, but a living force that adapted to the needs of each generation. To understand Shona priesthood is to recognize how ancestors and land were not abstract symbols, but active agents in history. And the mediums were the interpreters who kept their voices alive. Among the Tswana and Soto peoples of Botswana, Lesotho, and South Africa, the figure of the Dingaka, or Ngaka, reveals another powerful dimension of Southern African priesthood. These were diviners, healers, and rainmakers, whose work was indispensable in societies dependent on seasonal cycles of rainfall and agriculture. The Ngaka's role as rainmaker placed them at the heart of communal survival, for without rain, no crops could grow, and without crops, no community could thrive. Rituals for rain often involved elaborate ceremonies with chants, dances, and offerings designed to align human petition with ancestral and natural forces. But the Ngaka was not only concerned with rain, they were also healers who treated illness through a combination of herbal medicine and spiritual insight. Much like the Dibias of the Igbo or the Nangas of Congo, they understood that sickness was rarely just physical. It could stem from broken taboos, curses, or disharmony with the ancestors. Divination was another key function of the Ngaka. Through bones, shells, or other sacred instruments, they read the hidden causes behind events, guiding individuals and communities toward solutions. Their authority extended into conflict resolution, much like the Nua leopard skin priests of East Africa, since they were seen as neutral arbiters whose words reflected spiritual truth. The Ngaka therefore embodied multiple layers of priesthood: healer, diviner, rainmaker, and judge. By fulfilling all these roles, they ensured that society remained in balance, reminding people that the survival of the community depended not only on human effort, but on proper alignment with spiritual and natural forces. The Xhosa Amagirha of South Africa provide yet another fascinating expression of Southern African priesthood. The Amagirha are diviners and healers whose authority often comes through dreams, visions, and ancestral calling. In Xhosa cosmology, dreams are not random images of the mind, They are channels through which ancestors communicate, offering warnings, guidance, or instructions. Those chosen to become Amagirha often undergo a profound initiation process marked by illness or spiritual crisis until they accept their calling. Once trained, they serve as interpreters of dreams, diagnosing spiritual and physical ailments, and prescribing rituals or medicines to restore balance. The Amagirha also act as protectors against witchcraft, an ever-present concern in Xhosa society as in many African cultures. They identify hidden enemies, counteract curses, and fortify their clients against spiritual harm. This role made them indispensable in times of uncertainty, as they provided reassurance and solutions where ordinary logic failed. But their function was not only defensive, they also presided over rituals that affirmed community identity and continuity. And it's much like the Akana Komfo of West Africa, the Amagirha were mediums of the ancestors, their voices carrying the authority of the unseen into the daily lives of the people. When we compare these three Southern African priesthood systems, a unifying theme emerges. They are custodians of the land and its ancestral spirits. The Shona Mhondoro mediums spoke for the lion spirits tied to kingship and soil. The Tswana and Soto Ngaka called the rains and healed the sick, ensuring that life itself could continue. The Xhosa Amagirha read the language of dreams and restored harmony when disorder threatened. In each case, priesthood was not an optional institution, but the lifeline of society, ensuring survival in landscapes where ecological cycles and spiritual forces were inseparable. These traditions also challenge modern assumptions about spirituality and governance. To the Western eye, rainmaking or dream interpretation may appear to be superstition, but within their cultural context, they were highly rational systems of survival. The rainmaker ensured ecological sustainability. The dream interpreter mediated ancestral wisdom, and the spirit medium safeguarded political legitimacy. To dismiss them is to misunderstand how African societies integrated ecology, spirituality, and governance into seamless systems of life. Far from being primitive, these priesthoods reveal a sophisticated understanding of the interdependence between human communities, the environment, and the cosmos. Southern Africa then stands as a testament to the adaptive power of priesthood. Unlike the massive temple complexes of Kemet or the formalized divination systems of Yoruba, these priesthoods worked in closer intimacy with land, ancestors, and ecological cycles. They were flexible, responsive, and deeply embedded in a community life. They were not only spiritual guides but also ecological stewards, reminding people that land was sacred, rain was a gift, and ancestors were ever-present guardians. To neglect them was to invite famine, conflict, and disorder. To honor them was to secure the balance upon which all life depended. In the end, the priesthoods of Southern Africa reveal a truth that resonates across the continent: that priests were not peripheral figures but the very heartbeat of society. They were the rain callers, the dream readers, the spirit mediums who ensured that human life remained aligned with forces greater than itself. Their power was not in crowns or armies, but in their ability to speak with the voice of land and ancestor, to mediate between the seen and the unseen. In their hands, survival became sacred, and society itself became a ritual of balance. East Africa presents a unique expression of African priesthoods, one shaped by open savannas, towering mountains, and the ever-present relationship between sky and earth. Unlike the heavily forested or river-based societies of West and Central Africa, East African communities often placed emphasis on high places, mountains, hills, and open plains, as sacred zones where human beings could commune with the divine. Here, priesthoods emerged as prophets, seers, and mediators between sky gods and the people, offering sacrifices, resolving conflicts, and guiding communities through times of both peace and crisis. What distinguished many East African priesthoods was their function as custodians of morality and cosmic alignment, standing as bridges between humanity and the great forces of the heavens. The priesthoods of the Kikuyu, Maasai, and Nuer exemplified this in powerful ways, showing us how deeply spirituality was interwoven with ecology, governance, and social order. Among the Kikuyu of Kenya, the priests of Kirinyaga, Mount Kenya, the sacred dwelling place of the high god Nyai, occupied one of the most important roles in East African priesthood traditions. To the Kikuyu, Ngai was the supreme deity, the creator and sustainer of life, who resided at the mountain's peak. Priests served as mediators between the community and Nyai, offering sacrifices and prayers on behalf of the people. These sacrifices were not performed casually. They took place at sacred fig trees, rivers, and particularly on the slopes of Mount Kenya, where the divine presence was believed to be most palpable. The priests were responsible for aligning the community with Ngai's will, particularly in matters of rain, fertility, and protection. During droughts, epidemics, or times of social strife, it was the priesthood that gathered the people in ritual, lifting up petitions to Nai for relief and guidance. The Kikuyu priesthood carried moral as well as ritual authority. Their role was not simply to conduct ceremonies, but to interpret the community's standing with the divine. If misfortune befell the people, the priests would investigate whether taboos had been broken or moral codes violated, calling for cleansing rituals or restitution. In this way, the priests functioned as both spiritual and ethical anchors, ensuring that human behavior remained in harmony with divine expectations. Their role as mediators between the people and the high god reveals a profound theological structure in Kikuyu society, one in which the priesthood ensured that the moral, ecological, and spiritual dimensions of life remained integrated and aligned. The Maasai of Kenya and Tanzania offer another remarkable example of East African priesthood, embodied in the figure of the Laibon. The Laibons were prophets, healers, and ritual leaders whose authority extended across every dimension of Maasai life. Unlike kings or chiefs whose power was political, the Laibons wielded spiritual authority that commanded deep respect. They were responsible for performing rituals to secure rain, bless warriors before battle, and heal the sick through both herbal remedies and spiritual practices. The Laibons were also visionaries believed to receive messages through dreams or trance-like states. These visions guided not only individual lives but the fates of entire clans, particularly in times of crisis such as war, famine, or drought. What made the Laibons unique was their dual role as both healers and wartime leaders. They did not fight in battles themselves, but they consecrated warriors, performed rituals of protection, and determined the auspicious times to engage in conflict. In this way, they ensured that war was never undertaken recklessly, but only when aligned with spiritual mandate. The Laibons thus embodied the balance between healing and conflict, preservation and struggle. They were the embodiment of Maasai resilience, ensuring that the people remained spiritually fortified in the face of the harsh challenges of pastoral life. The prophetic power of the Laibons was not confined to ritual alone. It often influenced politics and leadership. Some Laibons, such as the famous Mbatian in the 19th century, were said to have unified clans and guided the Maasai through periods of upheaval by invoking ancestral and divine authority. In this way, the priesthood of the Maasai transcended the role of mere ritual specialists. They were visionaries whose words could alter the direction of entire societies. Their presence reveals how East African priesthoods were deeply integrated into the political and ecological survival strategies of the people. The Nuer of South Sudan and Ethiopia bring yet another dimension to the East African priesthood through the institution of the leopard skin priest. Unlike kings or prophets, the leopard skin priest did not wield political power, nor did they lead through visions or sacrifices to high gods. Instead, their primary function was mediation, resolving conflicts, particularly those involving blood feuds. In newer society where cattle raids and disputes could easily escalate into cycles of violence, the leopard skin priest served as the neutral figure who could intervene and restore balance. When a killing occurred, the guilty party would often flee to the house of the leopard skin priest, seeking sanctuary. The priest would then act as mediator, negotiating compensation in the form of cattle and overseeing rituals of cleansing and reconciliation. This process was not optional, it was considered binding, for the leopard skin priest's authority derived not from political power, but from spiritual sanction. The priest invoked divine and ancestral authority to prevent vengeance from spiraling into chaos. By placing themselves at the center of conflict resolution, leopard skin priests ensured that society did not collapse under the weight of endless feuds. Beyond conflict mediation, leopard skin priests also served as spiritual protectors. They conducted rituals to cleanse individuals or communities from pollution caused by violence, disease, or broken taboos. In this sense, they were guardians of moral and spiritual purity, ensuring that the community remained aligned with divine order. Their presence underscores the central truth of East African priesthoods, that spiritual authority was not about domination, but about balance, mediation, and restoration. When viewed together, the priesthoods of East Africa reveal a shared thread. They functioned as mediators between human beings and forces greater than themselves, whether sky gods, ancestors, or the moral demands of society. The Kikoyu priests of Kirinyaga linked their people to Nyai, the creator, ensuring that life remained aligned with the supreme deity of the mountain. The Maasai Laibons guided their people through prophecy, healing, and ritual, consecrating both peace and war. The newer leopard skin priests ensured that justice and reconciliation prevailed over vengeance, anchoring society in moral order. In all three cases, priesthood was not about hierarchy or domination, but about maintaining balance between sky and earth, war and peace, guilt and reconciliation. East Africa's priesthoods also highlight a fascinating ecological dimension. In the open savannas where drought could devastate life, where war was often tied to cattle and resources, and where survival demanded cooperation, the priesthood ensured that communities did not lose sight of the larger order. They reminded people that even in times of hardship, human affairs were accountable to the divine, and that only by aligning with higher laws could survival be sustained. Their rituals, prophecies, and mediations were not abstract, but intensely practical, grounded in the lived realities of pastoral and agrarian societies. Thus, the East African priesthood systems illuminate the profound truth that across Africa, priests were not merely religious figures. They were the heartbeat of society, the interpreters of cosmic will, and the architects of harmony. In their hands, survival itself became sacred, and society was constantly realigned with the rhythms of sky, earth, and spirit. The Nile Valley holds a singular place in the spiritual history of humanity. Along the banks of this life-giving river arose priesthoods, whose scope and sophistication shaped not only African civilizations, but global civilization itself. Long before Europe developed its philosophies, long before Asia codified its mystical traditions, the Nile Valley priesthoods had already established elaborate systems of ritual, astronomy, medicine, and ethics that governed entire empires. Unlike many African priesthoods that were embedded in local communities and ecological cycles, the priesthoods of Nubia and Kemet developed into highly structured hierarchies, serving vast states and monumental temples. They were not merely village healers or diviners. They were custodians of cosmic order, engineers of the sacred, and keepers of knowledge so profound that it continues to intrigue and inspire scholars today. In Nubia, particularly in the kingdoms of Kush and later Meroe, the priesthood of Amun stood as one of the most powerful institutions in Africa. The cult of Amun had spread southward from Kemet, but in Nubia it took on unique forms that reflected the cultural identity of the people. Priests of Amun in Nubia often held authority rivaling that of kings, for they were believed to interpret the will of the god directly. Temples at sites such as Jebel Bakal became not only centers of worship but also hubs of political power, where priests determined the legitimacy of rulers and guided state policy. In some cases, the priesthood of Amun grew so influential that it could dethrone kings or elevate new ones, underscoring the deep entanglement between spiritual and political authority in Nubian society. Alongside Amun, the Nubians revered Apedemak, the lion-headed warrior god, whose priesthood was particularly prominent in Meroe. Apedemak's priests oversaw rituals of war, kingship, and fertility, embodying the fusion of martial strength with cosmic order. These priests ensured that warfare was not mere violence, but a sacred act aligned with divine will, and they consecrated kings as embodiments of the lion god's power. The presence of Apedemak's temples, adorned with elaborate carvings and astronomical alignments, reveals the intellectual depth of Nubian priesthoods. They were astronomers, timing rituals with celestial cycles, and guardians of moral and ecological balance, ensuring that the prosperity of the state flowed in harmony with the divine rhythms. The Nubian priesthoods were also astronomer priests. Like their counterparts in Kemet, they carefully observed the stars, tracking the rising of Sirius and the cycles of the moon, aligning temple rituals with cosmic events. These observations were not merely academic. They regulated agriculture, guided festivals, and ensured that human society moved in harmony with the great rhythms of the universe. In this way, Nubian priests were not only spiritual leaders, but also scientists of the sacred, bridging the gap between cosmology and daily survival. If Nubian priesthoods established a regional expression of cosmic order, it was in ancient Kemet, Egypt, that the priesthood reached its most elaborate and global form. The priesthoods of Kemet were immense institutions, often rivaling or surpassing the power of the pharaohs themselves. Organized into hierarchies and guilds, they presided over vast temple complexes that served not only as centers of worship but as schools, hospitals, observatories, and treasuries of knowledge. To speak of the Kemetic priesthood is to speak of an entire civilization organized around the principle of Ma'at, cosmic balance, truth, and justice. Among the most powerful were the priests of Amun, based at the Temple of Karnak in Thebes. The cult of Amun rose to such prominence that its high priests at times wielded greater authority than the pharaohs. These priests were not simply ritual functionaries, they were political actors, economists managing temple lands, and philosophers interpreting the mysteries of the divine. The wealth of the temples of Amun was staggering, and their influence stretched across the empire, shaping law, governance, and cultural identity. To be aligned with Amun was to be aligned with the very heartbeat of Kemet. The priests of Ra, centered at Heliopolis, held equal significance. As custodians of the sun god, they developed profound cosmologies that linked the daily journey of the sun across the sky with the eternal cycles of creation and rebirth. Their theological contributions helped shape the very idea of kingship, for the pharaoh was seen as the living embodiment of Ra's light on earth. These priests were astronomers as well as theologians, using solar observations to regulate calendars and agricultural cycles. Through their rituals, they ensured that the rising of the sun was not only a natural phenomenon, but a sacred guarantee of cosmic continuity. The priests of Osiris, based in Abydos, presided over the mysteries of death and resurrection. They developed elaborate rituals of burial and afterlife preparation, codifying the practices that produced the famous Egyptian Book of the Dead. These texts were not mere funerary manuals. They were profound metaphysical guides, teaching that life was a journey through stages of purification, judgment, and transformation. The Osirian priesthood ensured that the dead were not abandoned, but carried into new life. And in doing so, they provided the society with a moral framework that justice, truth, and righteousness determined the soul's eternal fate. Their work reveals the ethical dimension of priesthood in Kemet, reminding us that spirituality was inseparable from morality. The priests of Ptah in Memphis brought yet another dimension, emphasizing creation through thought and speech. Ptah, as the god of craftsmen and builders, embodied the idea that the world was shaped not by brute force, but by the power of divine utterance. His priests, therefore, were not only ritual specialists, but also patrons of artisans, engineers, and architects. They oversaw temple construction, maintained sacred knowledge of building techniques, and embodied the idea that the material world was an expression of divine order. In their work, we glimpse how the priesthood of Kemet fused spirituality with practical skill, creating monuments like the pyramids and temples that continue to astonish the world. The priestesses and priests of Hathor, goddess of love, music, and joy, reveal yet another aspect of the Kemetic spiritual universe. They presided over festivals, music, and dance, ensuring that celebration was itself a form of sacred ritual. Hathor's cult also had strong ties to women and fertility, showing us that priesthood in Kemet was not exclusively male, but inclusive of priestesses who played vital roles in maintaining balance and nurturing community. At the heart of all these priesthoods was the principle of Ma'at, the cosmic order that bound together gods, humans, and the universe. Priests were the custodians of Ma'at, ensuring that rituals, laws, and daily practices upheld truth, justice, and harmony. They performed offerings not merely to appease the gods, but to maintain the balance that sustained existence itself. To neglect these rituals was to risk chaos, and so the priesthood of Kemet became indispensable, not only for religion but for every aspect of civilization. Kemetic priests were also scholars and scientists. They studied medicine, developing surgical techniques and herbal remedies that influenced later Greek and Roman practices. They mapped the stars, creating astronomical systems that remain astonishing in their precision. They wrote texts on theology, philosophy, and ethics, many of which shaped the intellectual traditions of the Mediterranean and beyond. In short, they were the custodians of human knowledge, ensuring that wisdom was preserved, transmitted, and aligned with divine order. Taken together, the priesthoods of Nubia and Kemet represent the pinnacle of Africa's sacred systems. In Nubia, priests of Amun and Apedemak fused kingship with cosmic power, grounding political authority in divine mandate. In Kemet, priests of Amun, Ra, Osiris, Ptah, Hathor, and Ma'at created a structured universe where every aspect of life was tied to cosmic balance. These priesthoods were not primitive cults. They were intellectual, spiritual, and political institutions whose influence shaped the foundations of world civilization. The Nile Valley reminds us that African priesthood was never a marginal force. It was the very backbone of empire, the engine of knowledge, and the guardian of humanity's earliest attempts to align with the cosmos. Through their rituals, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, the priests of Nubia and Kemet gave the world one of its greatest gifts: the vision that human society could be organized not only through power, but through balance, truth, and the eternal rhythms of the universe. as we arrive at the end of this journey through Africa's sacred landscapes, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The priesthoods of Africa were not merely religious figures operating on the margins of society. They were the very infrastructure that held entire civilizations together. From the shrines of the Yoruba Babalawo to the temples of Amun in Kemet, from the Mhondoro mediums of the Shona to the Libons of the Maasai, priests and priestesses stood as guardians of the hidden codes of existence. They preserved law, not in books, but in rituals and oaths that bound communities to cosmic truth. They preserved memory, not in archives, but in orator and initiation systems that ensured the wisdom of the ancestors was never lost. They advanced medicine, combining herbal science with spiritual diagnosis. They mapped the heavens, recording astronomy with precision that aligned calendars, crops, and rituals with the stars. And they administered justice, not through courts of stone, but through divination, moral authority, and the balance of spiritual laws. When we look closely, we see that priesthood was the invisible glue binding the social, ecological, and cosmic order. A king might wear a crown, but without the sanction of the priesthood, his reign was fragile. A farmer might till the soil, but without the blessing of rainmakers and ancestral rituals, his harvest was uncertain. A healer might treat the body, but without a divination, the deeper causes of illness remained unresolved. In this way, priesthoods were not accessories to power. They were its foundation, its scaffolding, its moral compass. They were the engineers of balance in a world where survival demanded alignment with both the seen and the unseen. Priesthood was not just religion, it was technology, it was justice, it was memory, it was the programming of destiny. These words summarize the depth of what we have uncovered. The priests of Africa understood the world not as a random chaos, but as a living system of laws, rhythms, and sacred codes. Their rituals were not empty gestures, but precise technologies for aligning human beings with the cosmos. Their divination systems were not games of chance, but diagnostic tools for understanding cause and effect in both spiritual and material realms. Their custodianship of memory was not nostalgia, but a profound recognition that without knowing where you came from, you cannot know where you are going. To recover this truth is to recover a deeper understanding of African civilization itself. And so, the final call is this. Let us remember these priesthoods as the invisible architects of African civilization. They were the ones who kept the balance, who maintained harmony, who carried the codes of the ancestors into every generation. Their legacy is not dead. It lives on in rituals still performed, in proverbs still spoken, in songs still sung, and in the spiritual resurgence of African peoples across the world today. May you, the listener, take this journey further. Recognize that what has been called religion was in fact a science of the sacred. Understand that what has been dismissed as superstition was often a system of profound intelligence encoded in ritual, divinations, and cosmic law. And above all, see in these priesthoods a mirror of what humanity has always needed. Figures who mediate between the seen and the unseen, between the fragile and the eternal, between humanity and the cosmos. If this journey stirred something within you, let it not end here. Like the priesthoods themselves, this knowledge must circulate, must be shared, must be kept alive. So, I invite you, like this video, leave a comment with your reflections, share it with others who seek truth, and subscribe to continue walking the path into Africa's hidden spiritual systems. This is not the end, but a beginning. A reminder that the codes of the ancestors are still with us, waiting to be remembered, honored,